Dr. Nabeel Quereshi is a New York Times best-selling author and an itinerant speaker with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Since completing his medical degree in 2009, he's dedicated his life to spreading the gospel through teaching, preaching, writing, and debating. Dr. Quereshi has lectured to students at over 100 universities, including Columbia, Dartmouth, Johns Hopkins, Oxford, Cambridge, and the University of Hong Kong. He's participated in 18 public debates around North America, Europe, and Asia. Following the release of his first book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, he received the Christian Book Award for the categories of both Best New Author and Best Nonfiction of 2015. Dr. Quereshi focuses on the foundations of the Christian faith, ancient Judaism, early Islam, and the interface of science and religion. He's a medical doctor holding his MD from Eastern Virginia Medical School, an MA in Christian Apologetics from Biola University, an MA in Religion from Duke University. He took language and religion classes at Rice in 2012 to 2013 and was then admitted to the religion department at Rice to pursue his PhD. However, at the last minute, he declined the offer from Rice and went full-time with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, concurrent with his attaining a Master's of Philosophy degree in Judaism and Christianity from Oxford University in the UK. He's currently pursuing a doctorate in New Testament studies at Oxford University. He's a busy guy, and there's a lot going on here. I've known Dr. Quereshi from the time he studied here at Rice, and what most impressed me about him is that he is a man dearly loved by many. He is a YouTube sensation, and his debates and lectures totaling well over 1 million views. He has a wife, Michelle, and a 1.5-year-old daughter, Aya. Something which Dr. Quereshi has been quite public about is that he returned to Houston in the summer of 2016 for treatment at MD Anderson Cancer Center after receiving the diagnosis of stage 4 stomach cancer with a projected survival period of 9 months and a 4% chance of recovery. He has completed all his rounds of chemotherapy, and he just completed his radiation therapy. He has thousands of concerned friends, YouTube followers, and readers of his books around the world that are praying for his recovery. So we're especially grateful that he would come here and be with us this evening. And so if you'd join me in welcoming Dr. Nabeel Quereshi.
Reading all those degrees would make me sound like a thermometer. They just kind of happened. I didn't intend for that. It was actually the passionate pursuit of truth that was really driving me in all of my studies. I started off studying medicine because at the age of 7, I remember being in the optometrist's office, and he had an eyeball sitting next to the desk where I was waiting, and it was showing the different layers of the retina, and I was just captivated. I thought, how in the world, given that there's 10 layers to a retina, are we able to detect light and also be able to distinguish images? And those images come into your brain upside down, your optical cortex, reverse them so that you can actually see them right way up. And that fact to me was just astounding. How does the human body work? How does the mind work? The physiology of it all was so complex and fascinating that from a very early age, I decided I want to study science mainly for the beauty of this world, to understand how this world works, and to understand how the human body works. I think the human body is perhaps the most beautiful thing in all of nature. And also, of course, I am Asian, so my parents were pushing me to become a doctor. It's just how it works. And so my desire mixed with their influence meant that I was going to go to medical school. In medical school, I began to ask some of the bigger questions. Actually, in college, I began to ask some of the bigger questions about life. Why are we here? What does it mean for us to have reason? What is our ultimate destiny? What is morality? And a lot of these questions, science could advise me on, but they wouldn't hold the ultimate answer. And so some of these questions come from theology. Now, at the time, of course, I was a devout Muslim. And so I came with the Islamic theological perspective. And on the sheer theistic plane, Islam and Christianity were quite close to one another. Both believe in an omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient God who will judge mankind at the end of time. a God to whom we can turn to in prayer, a God who commissions angels, demons are in the world as well, an afterlife, etc. Islam and Christianity are very close on this issue. But the dividing factor between Islam and Christianity, there are many, but the primary dividing factor between Islam and Christianity is the issue that we're going to discuss today as well, the issue of Jesus and his resurrection. Did Jesus die on the cross and rise from the dead? Of course, Islam says no, absolutely not. Jesus did not die on the cross. He's not God, and of course, therefore, if he didn't die on the cross, he didn't rise from the dead. Christianity answers the question with a resounding yes. Jesus claimed to be God, and he died on the cross and rose from the dead to prove his claim to be God. Now, these were questions that I was wrestling with when I was about your age, studying at the university. I was in Old Dominion University, was where I studied my undergraduate years. The question of the resurrection ultimately affects so much about how we see ourselves and how we see the world around us, especially if you're looking at it from an agnostic or atheistic point of view. And I've realized over my years in studies at the universities that I've attended that generally speaking, it doesn't matter if you're a theist or an atheist or an agnostic, it doesn't matter if you're Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, the way we generally approach the world around us in arenas of higher education is more or less from an atheistic perspective, from an agnostic perspective. And I can understand that because it's a lowest common denominator sort of approach. Hey, we all agree that the world exists. We all agree that we can learn about the world from science. Let's use that as our background for understanding the world. But built into the inquiry and endeavor of understanding the world from a scientific perspective are certain assumptions, which we're going to discuss shortly, a certain method of approaching the world. And ultimately, it leads to an atheistic or agnostic understanding and undergirding of how the world works. And the question of the resurrection, therefore, has tremendous impact. If the resurrection of Jesus actually happened, it changes the way we see humans. It changes the way we see ourselves. It changes the way we see our lives on the schema of history and mankind. So this question is tremendously important. Did Jesus rise from the dead? And the question is posed from an interesting angle today. Can a scientist believe that Jesus rose from the dead? So I stand here saying to you that of everything that I have studied, I've studied medicine, I've studied theology. My doctorate right now in Oxford, the one I'm studying, is based on the New Testament, specifically the Gospel of Mark is what I'm working on. And out of everything I've studied, the question of does God exist is the one that matters the most. It affects us more deeply than any other question. And as soon as we answer that question, the following questions also matter. What is he like? What has he done? And who are we in his grand plan? And so these are some of the things I want to discuss today. By way of introduction, I also want to point out that it is Holy Week. You might have missed that if you live under a rock, but most university students do. And that rock is called exams, and I totally get it. So just so you know, it's Holy Week. Palm Sunday was this past Sunday. Tomorrow is Maundy Thursday. And then we have Good Friday, followed by Easter on Sunday. The day that Jesus was in the tomb would be Friday night to Sunday morning. And Sunday is the ultimate realization of the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? Christians celebrate that question with the resounding answer, yes, this upcoming Sunday. So this is a very apropos time to discuss the question. I also want to clarify some things about myself. The introduction from Dr. Tour was very generous, but I have a degree in medicine. My medical degree is not technically a science degree. It's an applied science degree. It's a clinical science degree. It doesn't make doctors scientists. So I want to make sure that's clear to you. I'm not coming up here claiming to be a research scientist. I'm not. I'm trained in clinical medicine. But in order to study clinical medicine, you have to stand on the shoulders of many scientists and their conclusions. You have to understand the scientific method. So I have interacted with that, and that is an expertise of mine to a smaller degree than a scientist's. I'm not a philosopher per se. I don't have a PhD in philosophy, but to study what I have studied, I have studied philosophy of religion, I've studied the philosophy of science, and so I've engaged in these areas, and I'm hoping to be conversant enough with them such that I'll be able to impart some things with you who might not have studied those areas. And I'm not even a theologian per se. So even though I'm getting a degree, a PhD in religion from Oxford University, my focus is on the historical development of the Christian religion, specifically the New Testament, and how the New Testament came to be within the context of the Greco-Roman society and the Jewish cradle in which Christianity was born. I do believe that Christianity was conceived within an environment of Judaism in a Hellenized context of first century Palestine. So that is kind of my background. My expertise tonight is in the interdisciplinarity of these issues, that I've dabbled in all of them, I've gotten degrees in all of them, but I wouldn't call myself an expert theologian or philosopher or scientist. Are you with me on that? Just want to make sure that I don't set up any false expectations here. One last thing that I do want to say is I have tremendous respect for science and religion. A lot of people try to dichotomize science and religion, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But my interest in theology was born out of the same drive that gave me an interest in science, which is to understand the world around me, the beauty and the complexity of the world around me, and the reality of the world around me. The same drive led me to have a tremendous respect for both science and for religion, and that's where I'm coming from. To quote Alistair McGrath, both science and faith, when at their best, help us to make sense of who we are, why we are here, and what we ought to do. We need that rich vision not simply to exist, but to live. Alistair McGrath is the professor. He holds the chair of science and religion at Oxford University, and I had the privilege to study under him while I was at Oxford. Finally, as we get started, I feel compelled to pray. If you want to join me and pray, please do. If you don't, that's fine too. Just bear with us who do want to pray for just a moment as we ask God to be present today. God, I thank you so much for giving us eyes to see, ears to hear. God, even modern scientists with all their powerful discoveries and abilities to help people, medically speaking, cannot reproduce such a thing as a brain that functions, cannot take a mass of tissue and give it life, let alone conscientious life. And so, God, I just want to proclaim that you are. You are. And I'm so thankful for that. And I pray, God, that as we discuss these issues of life and science, that I would say nothing false, that I would say nothing in order to curry favor, but everything carefully and rigorously approached so that we can get to the matter of truth. And I pray that we would glorify you in all our discussions. I pray this in your name. Amen. Okay, so to start with the question then, we're looking at the topic science, God, resurrection. So there's a period after science, a period after God, and question mark with resurrection. But I find that the question begins with the very first word, science. Do we actually know what science is? And I say this both tongue-in-cheek, but also a little bit more deeper on the philosophical plane. As I was going through medical school, I remember we had classes on ethics longitudinally throughout the 4 years that I was in medical school. And we would discuss such questions as, can we put a price tag on life? Because the reality is, we have a certain number of dollars that we can spend in healthcare and a certain number of people to whom we can appropriate those dollars. How much money do we give to every person? Or in what condition do we give it to them? 90% of the money spent on healthcare in the United States is spent on the last 18 months of a person's life. Would it be ethical to say this person probably has less than 18 months to live? Let's not fund them so we can fund 9 times more other people in their efforts and endeavors to live. Is that an ethical approach? And the fact of the matter that I discovered as I was in medical school was people had no basis off which to even begin answering those questions. Because those people who were studying medicine often had not studied ethics, had not studied philosophy, let alone the philosophy of science. There was just this underlying assumption that science was somehow the mode of receiving all truth in the world. That basically, if you could not understand it by science, it was not worth understanding. And then when they were approached with questions like these, ethical questions, they had no basis off which to even begin to answer them. And quite frankly, I would say that I would fall into that category as well, were it not for the fact that I had to interact with others who pushed me to understand the bases of this question. So Samir Okasha, who's a professor at York University, has said this, quote, "Something quite like science worship is a genuine feature of the intellectual landscape." And this is what has given rise to the new atheism that we see in the academic circles around us. Also at Oxford University, I frequently saw Richard Dawkins biking down the street with his helmet. It was rather cute, I would say, just him on his little bike biking down the street. Like, oh, that's Richard Dawkins. His area of science, and also Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris, etc., the new atheists, tend to capitalize on the notion that no knowledge is true knowledge apart from scientific knowledge. But is that necessarily true? And I would argue that it's obvious that is not true. For the vast majority of us who saw the recent comments about the Holocaust in the news recently, the Holocaust centers and all that, I'm not going to go into the politics of that all, we would all agree that the Holocaust was abhorrent, was perhaps one of the worst events in all of human history, plumbing the depths of human depravity. But none of those statements can we affirm or assert from a scientific perspective. Absolutely none. You can't use science to say the Holocaust was wrong. In fact, it was science that people were using within the Nazi legislation to argue that the Holocaust was right. Science based on the eugenics movement, saying that in order for humanity to advance, we need to weed out weaker members of society. Who are weaker members of society? The Jews were argued as some of those. And of course, the Holocaust wasn't just directed at Jews, but tremendously so. And Jews were singled out as people who showed the weakness of mankind, as opposed to, of course, the Aryan race, which is the stronger form of mankind. So let's weed out the weak in order to advance the strong. Because the enterprise of mankind is to survive, to evolve. Therefore, let's weed out the weak for the sake of the strong. A very quick and crude generalization, of course, of the eugenics movement. I apologize for having to make it so short, but that is at least how the Nazis saw the eugenics movement, and they were using that information in order to capitalize and to defend the Holocaust. You cannot use science to answer questions of ethics. And yet, we see people saying that the only knowledge worth having is the knowledge based on science. No, science has its limitations. But unfortunately, because of this prevailing understanding, as Professor Okasha says, that science is almost worthy of being worshipped in the intellectual arena, people don't answer the questions specifically about the extents and limitations of science. What is science? How do we even define what science is? Philosophers of science have tremendous difficulty answering that question. So, what is science? I pose the question to you tonight. And generally speaking, people might try to categorize things, and they'll say, well, biology is science, and physics is science, and astronomy is science. And I would say, yes, those are instances of science, but what is science? What is the principle that binds all of these individual fields of study together? And you'll also have people who would argue for certain forms of science that others would not, such as social sciences. Is anthropology a science? Anthropologists would want to say yes, whereas people in the hard scientists would say no. Cognitive sciences, are those hard sciences? You have people who would disagree on that. History, the historical study of the past. You're trying to explain data using models to the best explanation, inference to best explanation. Exactly what science does, but is history a scientific enterprise? Most people would say no. So how can we define what science is? It's extremely difficult when we start getting down to it. Are we going to say that science is an attempt to understand the world? Well, so is religion. Religion is an attempt to understand the world. So are the arts. So is poetry. So the arts are trying to do the exact same thing, but no one would argue, generally speaking, that the arts are a science. Is it a particular method of investigating the world? Is science that which involves experimentation? Most people would say yes, but there are fields of accepted science, such as astronomy, that are not experimental, they are observational. And so can we hang our hats on the experimental nature of sciences, of hard sciences? No, we cannot. What about, trying to go a little bit deeper, science is a construction of truth based only on observed data and proved models of explanation. You're trying to drill a little bit more in there, and we're saying it's a construction of truth based only on observed data and proved models of explanation. Unfortunately, that doesn't even work. The definition of observation, and we know observation is critical to science, but the definition of observation is even a difficult one within the bounds of science. So for example, can using an instrument be a part of observation? So if I drop a ball off the Leaning Tower of Pisa to see if it falls at the same rate as a lighter ball, of course Galileo is the one who argued that mass doesn't determine the effect of gravity on an object. Is that actually, or weight, sorry, doesn't determine. Is that actually something that I'm observing? And we would all answer yes. A ball, if you're watching a ball fall off the Leaning Tower of Pisa, that's observation. Now, what if I watch the ball through a telescope? Am I still observing it, or is the instrumentalism that's working as an intermediary, meaning I'm not actually observing it? Well, most people would argue you are still observing it if you're looking through a telescope, and that's fine. But what about when it comes to atoms? We know atoms exist, but no one has ever seen an atom. Now, we use electrons microscopes to see what approximates an atomic cloud, but is that really what observing an atom at that point? We're reconstructing an image digitally in order to understand what might be there. Is that observation in and of itself? The first scatter plots of molecules that were the basis of quantum theory never actually observed it. But we believe in quantum theory, and quantum theory has provided us with lasers. And lasers we can understand and see that they actually work, and we can see the power of guided missiles, and we can understand our DVD players work. And so we say, well, the results of these observations still work, therefore we're observing. But are we? No one's actually ever seen the electrons change in energy in that way, or have they? So the question of observation is a very difficult one to grasp. But I would also even argue that, let's go back to our working question here, proven models of explanation. The word proof, historically speaking, means deductive reasoning, and we're going to come back to this in just a moment. But the vast majority of science is not done with deductive reasoning, it's done with inductive reasoning. So can we say that we're actually proving anything when we use inductive reasoning instead of deductive reasoning? We're going to come back to this in just a moment. But all this to say, it's not at all easy to demarcate science. What is science? Not at all easy to answer, and philosophers of science have been very familiar with that for a long time, the problem involved in demarcating what science is. So that's a place to start with. Now, what I want to emphasize is that science is, at the very least, an attempt to corral our avenues of receiving knowledge and to strengthen them. So, in other words, there are ways we receive knowledge. There are ways we build up our knowledge base. Science is an attempt to establish and strengthen those ways. I want to give you 4 ways tonight that we strive for knowledge. The primary one is through our senses, and we all understand this. So senses we use to gain knowledge. Science attempts to intensify the use of our senses. So for example, if we look and see something, great. How about we use a telescope to see further away? How about we use a microscope to see at a smaller level? Science is using instruments to determine and to intensify our senses. Okay? Avenue number 2 is testimony. To understand the results that others have come up with in their investigation and to incorporate that into our own knowledge base. In other words, when somebody tells you something, you're gaining knowledge through their testimony. Science attempts to intensify this, primarily through avenues such as publishing. So people have published their results in experimentation. That's their testimony to what they have discovered, scientifically speaking. And so science capitalizes and intensifies the route of testimony. A third avenue of gaining knowledge is through rationalized thought, careful, reasoned thought. So if we deduce something by our thought, then we can come up to a new item of knowledge. Science intensifies that by peer-reviewed journals, specifically on methodology. As we're thinking about an experiment and as we're planning it out, we publish the methodology of that experiment so that others can see, was our reasoning correct or incorrect? And I know many of us, as we study journal articles, skip the methodology section. That is an expedient. Let's not do that, if at all possible, because methodology is often where science is flawed. And so we need to understand whether the reasoning used is good reasoning. Science intensifies that through a peer review of methodology. Finally, memory. By our memory, we have access to knowledge. Science intensifies this through the annals of publications, through years and years and years of publication. So if you want, you can go back and read what Isaac Newton wrote in the 17th century. And I have to say, with a measure of pride, that Isaac Newton was at my college in Oxford, Christ Church College. Just going to drop that out there. But memory is also a component. So senses, testimony, thought, and memory, the four avenues through which we receive knowledge, are intensified by science. That's what science is attempting to do, is to intensify and make more reliable our normal avenues of receiving knowledge. So it's not something magical, it's not something separate, it's not something so different and disparate from our normal avenues of receiving knowledge that it can be considered on a pedestal of its own. Scientism, which we'll be talking about in a moment, tries to dichotomize science from all other avenues of receiving knowledge, but it's not that different. It's just intensified and an attempt to defend that knowledge that we attain through normal avenues. But out of these ways of intensifying our knowledge acquisition come some of the bases of the scientific method, and two in particular that I want to discuss today are testable hypotheses and reproducible results. In order to be actually following the scientific method, especially in the experimental realms of scientific inquiry, you need to have a testable hypothesis, and you need to have reproducible results. So within the chemistry lab, you're going to try to test your hypothesis, and the results need to be able to be reproduced, not just by you, but by other people who studied it as well. Given these parameters, now I want us to understand, the moment you add parameters, they might be good parameters, but the moment you add parameters to a method, you are limiting what that method is useful for. All of a sudden, you can't answer certain questions. In this case, it has to be something that's reproducible in a lab. In a lab, that means it has to have a closed system. You can't have an open system, otherwise the results might not be reproducible. So you have to have a closed system. The questions about God in the universe automatically imply an open system. If you're talking about the universe itself apart from God, you have a closed system. But the moment you ask the question about the creator of the universe, you have something outside the system that you're taking into account. Science has difficulty answering that because it's no longer falling within the parameters in which science investigates. Are you with me so far? That was a lackadaisical nod, but I'll go with it. I will take it. So the questions that science then engages in are of a limited kind, and we're going to come back to this in just a moment. Let's move on to the next topic, science and faith. Now that we have attempted to define what science is more accurately, we've actually discussed some of the problems with defining science. Let's move to this dichotomy between science and faith. Oftentimes, people assume, when they're looking at science and faith, that science is something that is well understood, well grasped, and is the pedestal, the apex of knowledge. And faith is something that you believe when you have no reason to believe it. That's often how faith is caricatured. Whereas in reality, we've just discussed how science is not this immovable, obvious object that we use. It's a little bit more fuzzy than that. And faith, well, faith is actually a part of science. Well, what do I mean by this? All right, let's look at the different ways faith are often defined. Now, the new atheists tend to define faith as something that you have no reason in and of itself to believe. You just believe it. Generally on authority, you take information that's given to you and you believe it. So, for example, I believe what the Bible says. Why do you believe what the Bible says? Because the Bible says it and I have made the Bible my authority. The new atheists would characterize this as a form of faith, as the primary form of faith. A secondary definition, so let's call that first definition of faith blind faith. A secondary approach to faith I would call inference based on evidence. In other words, you have a body of evidence that leads you to conclude that there's a likely or probable understanding of something else. And because of the body of evidence you have, you can conclude on inductively usually, on something else. So for example, I just flew back from Malaysia a few days ago. I just got back in on Friday. When I got on the plane, I can guarantee you I did not examine the plane. I did not check out the wings to see if there was structural integrity. I did not check out the landing gear to see if it worked. I didn't go to the pilot and do a breathalyzer test to see if he was sober. None of those things did I do. But I believed that plane would get me back to the United States. I had enough faith in the airline that the airline was doing those things, that I could just blithely walk onto the plane and stake my life on the fact that I will be coming back. Interestingly, it was Malaysian Airlines, so I'm not sure if I should have. Too soon? Probably shouldn't have said that. All the same, I trusted Malaysian Airlines well enough that I believed they had done the background work. Now, is that foolish? Is it foolish to walk onto a plane where you have tested none of the gear itself, none of the pilots themselves, none of the protocol? You don't even know what it is, yet you walk onto that plane. Why? Because the vast majority of planes that take off, come back, and do not crash, do not go missing, the vast majority do not. And so you're staking your life on the faith that you have in that airline. Is that foolish? And I would answer, obviously not. That's how we work almost all of our decisions in life. When you get onto the highway, you know that there have been accidents on the highway. You know that people die. In fact, more people die in vehicle collisions than do in airplane accidents. Yet, we get on the highway anyway, believing we're going to make it to where we want to go. This is faith. Truly, it is faith based on the experiences that we've had. You have no inherent reason to believe that that specific trip will work out. It hasn't happened yet. On the scientific level, even the fact that the sun is going to rise the next day cannot be scientifically proven. You can believe that it's going to happen because every previous day the sun has risen. You can believe because of the laws of physics that they will continue to work the way they have always worked, but you have no inherent reason to believe that apart from inductive reasoning. And the very notion of all of science is deductive reasoning, is proof, is flawed. The vast majority of science is not deductive reasoning. So, when I get on an airplane, I have good reason to have faith in that airplane company. To make it a little bit more personal, when we're deciding who to marry, we will say that I have a faithful wife or I have a faithful husband. Now, my wife isn't in the room right now. I have no idea what she's doing. No clue. But I have faith in her. Why? Because I know her character. I've seen her character. I've seen her for years and years. I understand what she's like, and given that I know what she's like in personal context, I can have faith in who she is. And it's not a poor assumption to have that faith. And so we operate in terms of faith on our daily life. We choose the most important person to walk through life with based on faith in who they are, who their character is. Now, let's turn back to science. Do we use blind faith when it comes to science? And the answer is yes. The vast majority of us and our scientific knowledge, even if you are a scientist, the vast majority of knowledge that you have in science was gained simply by trusting authorities in the field of science. Most of us believe in the planets in the solar system. Pluto is kind of an issue. We'll leave Pluto out of it. But the rest of the planets, we believe that they're planets. Most of us have not looked through a telescope to see those planets. We've had no evidence of our own. We believe the scientists and the astronomers who say that they're there based on their authority, based on the consensus of the people around us. But we just have blind faith in those people. So blind faith, especially when we're growing up as children learning these things, when you were learning about the solar system as a child, you didn't even rationally think, okay, well, these people have reputations that are on the line, therefore they wouldn't lie. You didn't think any of that. They just said, there's 9 planets. And you're like, okay, there's 9 planets. That's how we gain most of our knowledge. Most of us have not seen an atom. Most of us have not determined for ourselves biochemical pathways. Dr. Tour, of course, you're the exception, along with others studying under him. But most of us haven't seen it for ourselves. And yet, in medical school, I sat down and memorized pathway after pathway after pathway in order to understand the processes of medicine and human physiology. But we haven't seen it for ourselves. We're just believing it on blind faith. I don't even know the guys who wrote the textbook, and yet I believed them. And that's how we approach science for the most part. So blind faith is a large part of our scientific base of knowledge. But more importantly, I would say inference based on evidence, that form of faith, is also a large part of science. What do I mean by this? Let's talk about inductive reasoning. Every case of sickle cell anemia that's been studied at the genetic level has been determined to be present due to a single point mutation. Okay, a single point mutation leads to sickle cell anemia in every case that's been studied. You can use deductive reasoning if you're limiting your scope to just those cases that have been studied. Every case that's been studied of sickle cell anemia has shown a single point mutation. Does sickle cell anemia, in the cases studied, is it correlated to a single point mutation? Deductively, yes. Conclusion, done. Proof. But when we go from what we've investigated to all the other cases of sickle cell anemia that we haven't investigated, and we say, because this limited scope in 100% of the cases showed a single point mutation causing sickle cell anemia, therefore, all the other cases that we haven't investigated can be concluded to be the cause of the same mutation. That is inductive reasoning, and you cannot prove it. And yet all of science, not all of science, but the vast majority of science is built on that kind of reasoning. You assume that all of sickle cell anemia is functioning the same way as the cases you studied. But that's not proof. That's inductive reasoning, i.e. faith, as it's defined by the primary definition of faith, I believe. Same thing with Down syndrome. You've got trisomy 21. On the 21st chromosome, you have a triplicate instead of a duplicate. In just the cases we've studied, can we be sure of that? But we impute that to all the cases, and we do so rightly. I'm not saying that's wrong, but that is an exercise of inductive reasoning. That is an exercise of faith. And it's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But to dichotomize science and faith is extremely problematic. For those of you who will go on to medical school or pharmacy school and study pharmacology, we prescribe tons of medicines that we know are not going to work for a certain portion of the population, because medication only works for some people, and if it works for enough people, we then prescribe it to all people. But we know it's not necessarily going to work, and yet we prescribe it anyway because it's the best way to approach the population dynamics. That's fine, but we're doing so based on less than deductive reasoning. And so when people approach science to say this is a specialized form of knowledge that goes above and beyond any type of faith is simply incorrect. The people who are saying that have generally not studied the philosophy of science or the way science works. Which leads me to scientism. Now, for those of you who want a definition of scientism, it usually is a pejorative term that's used by philosophers, but it is a real issue. When people believe that science is the only way to acquire knowledge, they have made a tremendous mistake. Science has its limitations. Like I said earlier, you need to have something with a testable hypothesis and reproducible results for most forms of the hard sciences to count. But most of what we know is not reproducible or testable. So for example, if I find a cake sitting on my table, as I did yesterday, my wife threw a surprise birthday party for me. If I find a cake saying, "I love you," written on a table, I can tell you the exact processes by which that cake was baked. I can tell you about flour, I can tell you about the water, I can tell you about the heat, I can tell you about the frosting and how it works chemically, and the sugars and how they break down. I can tell you about all that. But I cannot use science to tell you that my wife actually loves me. Science will not give me that answer. Also, there are certain questions, and this was posed pretty well by Rhodes, who was the president of Cornell University from 1977 to 1995. He gave a fascinating example. He said, if you ask the question, why is that kettle of water boiling? We can answer it by saying, well, there's a fire underneath the kettle that's causing energy to be transferred to the water. The water is undergoing a phase change. That phase change then causes the steam to come out of the kettle and to make this whistling sound, and we know the kettle is boiling. You can answer the question that way, or you can say, I wanted a cup of tea. You can answer the question both ways, and here's what Rhodes says. These are different answers, but both are true. Both are complementary and not competitive. One is appropriate within a particular frame of reference, the other within another frame of reference. There is a sense in which each is incomplete without the other. One is a scientific answer, and one is an answer about personal agency. You need really to have both in order to understand the reality of the question. So, I posit that science invites supplementation. It has its own limits, it has its own extents, it is extremely useful, but it invites supplementation because it can only answer certain kinds of questions. And the other questions, honestly, are the ones that drive us a lot more. So we're talking about, like I said, ethics or love. Science cannot answer those questions, but neither can it answer questions of, for example, history. Do we know that Caesar crossed the Rubicon? Of course, a touchstone event in the history of the Roman Empire. But can we be sure it happened? Science cannot answer that question for us. It's not something that's testable in a lab or reproducible. It happened once. History has to answer that question for us. Now, is there a historical method that we can use to strengthen and intensify our ability to acquire knowledge, much like science does so in the testable realm of experiments? Can history have a method which helps us understand the reality of history and whether or not certain testimony is likely to be true? Can we apply that method to another question? Did Jesus rise from the dead? The question we're going to discuss today. Now, before we get to that question in particular, I want to discuss the question of God now. We talked about science, and I would say God also enters the picture of science to a certain degree. Now, I would go into a discussion of intelligent design right now, but it's actually very controversial, and so I would leave that to people who are much more versed in the intelligent design movement. Instead, what I'm going to focus on is where God inevitably bumps up in the issue of science as we try to investigate science. Now, when we talk about certain things, so if I were to drop this water bottle onto the ground, without the cap on, the water would spill. But if I were to drop the water bottle onto the ground, might as well do it. Drop the water bottle. I can say, because of a pre-existing law of gravity, which applies generally speaking, this specific instance of a bottle of water was subject to that law of gravity. You have two bodies with mass, they are drawn to each other, proportional to the distance in between them. Fine, we can understand that. But where does the law of gravity come from? Where does that general law come from, this natural law? Isaac Newton never made an effort to answer the question. And we're going to have, if we did try to answer that question, why does this law apply the way it does? If we do try to answer that question, then we're going to have another general law which explains the instance of the law of gravity, and then we're going to have another question asked. Where does that general law come from? And ultimately in science, you're going to have an infinite regress. You're going to have an ultimate beginning. Where did all of this come from? And that's the question that a lot of scientists have been trying to chase down, but it's an extremely difficult one to answer. And we haven't had any success really in trying to answer it. Long story short, there must be a beginning. There must be a beginning unless you're going to have an infinite regress. Now, for a long time, scientists were trying to argue for an infinite age of the universe, that there was no origin to the universe. Of course, we discovered redshift in the mid-20th century, and we realized that objects within the universe are expanding from each other at a certain rate, expanding away from one another at a certain rate. Therefore, there was a singularity from which the universe began. That, of course, is called the Big Bang. Now, the moment the Big Bang was elaborated within science, many scientists pushed back against it very starkly because of the same reason scientists are pushing back against intelligent design. They were saying this is an attempt to smuggle God into science through the back door. Specifically speaking, I'll quote John Maddox. Now, John Maddox was the editor of Nature magazine. Nature magazine is probably one of the most prominent magazines in scientific study, even today. I believe Dr. Tour said he was just recently approved for an article in Nature magazine. And so Nature is high up there. John Maddox is the editor of Nature magazine. Here's what he had to say. He published an article called Down with the Big Bang. Why? He said, because it's philosophically unacceptable, The origin of the Big Bang is not susceptible to discussion because creationists will have ample justification in the doctrine of the Big Bang. In other words, if we argue for a Big Bang, says the editor of Nature magazine, then we're arguing for the existence of God. Because you have a beginning. And if you have a beginning, someone had to start the beginning. Something had to be the cause. Everything that begins has a cause. And this is also known as the Kalam cosmological argument in the realm of philosophy. But everything that begins to exist has a cause. Only things which never began to exist do not have a cause. Well, if the universe began to exist, that means the universe has a cause. And we might as well call that cause God. That's what John Maddox is arguing, who of course is an atheist. And that's what a lot of creationist philosophers would argue as well. Now, to give just another quick look to this, at the beginning of the Big Bang, at the beginning of the universe, you would have exploding into existence from the singularity, time, space, and energy/matter. All exploding into existence from the single point. Time, space, and energy/matter. The thing that caused the universe to come into existence, whatever you call it, would therefore have to be outside time, i.e. eternal. It would have to be outside space, i.e. omnipresent. It would have to be outside energy/matter, i.e. omnipotent. So the very fact that a Big Bang happened, as was noticed by people like John Maddox, leads to the conclusion that there is an omnipresent, eternal, omnipotent creator of the universe, whom we might as well call God. So usually within the realm of science, this is where God crops up. Another place where God crops up, where I think he should not, is when people have no explanation for certain phenomena and they say, therefore, it must be God. That is what a lot of the new atheists point out as saying this is a God of the gaps argument. You say, well, since you can't explain it, you're just putting God into the gaps. And we've explained many things without God. We've explained many of these gaps, and we will explain future gaps without God as well. Fair enough. But notice what you're doing when you say that. You're saying you have faith in science. I have faith that science will explain these gaps. I have faith in science. That's fine. You can have faith in science. Science has accomplished much. It has told us much. You're allowed to have faith in it. But notice that's what you're doing. I'm not arguing that God of the gaps argument tonight. I'm simply pointing out that when you have science and God interacting, where it becomes most problematic is here at the beginning of things. God seems to be often present latently behind these phenomena. One place that I would think is very interesting, and people often point to this as a God of the gaps argument, but it is a fascinating one, is the origin of life. The origin of life is a very hard one to explain, an extremely hard one to explain. All the models that have been used have been shown to be problematic. We're still working out models, and who knows? Maybe scientists will someday come up with a viable explanation to the origin of life. But as for now, no such explanation exists. The attempts to produce them have failed, by and large, quite spectacularly. One last thing I want to cover before we turn to the history of the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is also miraculous phenomena. Now, many people assume that miracles don't happen, and a lot of this is built into Hume's approach to reality, and Hume has a lot to do with what we've been talking about tonight, by the way. But Hume argues that miracles simply don't happen. If they did, people would know about them more. I have, in my own anecdotal experience, asked a variety of crowds to show, with a show of hands, how many people have experienced a miracle. And generally speaking, 1/3 of the audience will raise their hand, no matter the audience. Hey, let's try this right now. Don't disprove me here just for the sake of disproving me. But how many of you would say, honestly, that you've experienced a miracle? If you take a look around you, Hume's primary argument that people have not experienced miracles fails. The universal experience of mankind is that people have. Now, were they actually experiencing one or not doesn't enter into Hume's equation. He's saying people simply don't see it, don't even think they see it. Whereas the vast majority of people in history do claim to have seen miracles. Whether they're right or not does not enter into Hume's equation. He's just saying they don't. The reality is they do. And they do crop up quite frequently. Now, I can give you many examples of miracles anecdotally, from lives of people I know. I can give you one from my own life. But I'll give you one from a friend of mine who was praying for healing. Her name is Christina, and she was praying for healing because her parents had a ministry of healing, and the Bible talks a lot about healing, and she wanted to start engaging in this. And so she had just attended a training session on healing, and the exercise was go out and start praying for people who need healing, and if those people actually are healed, bring them to give their testimony. And so she started asking people who needed healing. And one woman said, I cannot hear out of my right ear. So Christina says to the woman, do you mind if I pray for you? And the woman says, not at all. Christina prays for this woman's right ear. Hearing is restored to her ear. And she said, would you come and share this testimony? The woman came and shared the testimony with the church at large. And what Christina didn't know is that this woman had had a tumor in her head, on account of which the doctors had actually removed her internal ear. She did not have the physical capacity to hear. The bones were gone. And yet this woman was able to hear once again. Now, anecdotal story from my friend Christina. Do you want to believe it? You don't have to. Totally fine. I could be making it up. She could be making it up. Totally fine. Don't believe it. What about documented miracles, though? Down the street, we have a church called Lakewood Church. Joel Osteen is the pastor of that church. His mother is named Dodie Osteen. Now, in 1981, Dodie Osteen was diagnosed with terminal lymphoma. She was given 2 weeks to live. The doctor said, hey, you've got 2 weeks. If we give you chemo, we can make it 4 weeks. That's as good as you've got. Now, Dodie had experience with her daughter. Her daughter was born with cerebral palsy. And she and her husband scoured the scriptures, came up to the conclusion that Jesus heals miraculously, and said, we are going to pray for our daughter that she be healed of her cerebral palsy, and we will not stop until Jesus heals her. They pray and pray and pray, and what I've been taught medically, cerebral palsy is irreversible, yet their daughter was healed of cerebral palsy. Because of that experience, and you can actually see their daughter today if you want. Because of that experience, when Dodie was diagnosed with terminal lymphoma, she said, I am going to pray for healing. Never once received any chemotherapy, did not go through any herbal treatments, simply prayed for healing, standing on the scriptures of the New Testament and the Old Testament, and proclaiming them and declaring them over herself. She, inexplicably, against all medical odds, was healed of her lymphoma. This is documented. Her doctor's notes are documented. Pictures documenting it. She's still alive. She lives down the street. Go talk to her. She will tell you the story. Do you believe that? Some of you will. Some of you won't. What I have found is a lot of people who want to deny miracles do so claiming that there is no documentation. But there are. Have you looked for them? Have you looked for them? Let's go beyond Dodie. You'll say, well, what about peer-reviewed journal articles? Yes, miracles appear in peer-reviewed journal articles. There was a man who was in Africa, and this appeared in Life Anthropology, and I wish I had the exact date and title, etc. This report is documented through Craig Keener's book called Miracles. He talks about the specifics. I didn't have time to actually pull out the exact journal article. But this man talks about funeral rites in tribal areas of Africa. And he himself, a scholar, was present to see whether these things actually happened. This is kind of creepy, folks, so sorry ahead of time. But he was at this funeral rite where a person had died. He'd seen the body, saw that he was dead. In the course of the funeral, there was a portion where the shamans start playing the drums over the body, the dead body. This dead body, which was enshrouded and cloaked, all of a sudden started vibrating and gyrating and got up and took part in the drum playing until the shamans stopped and the body returned to its grave. This is reported in a peer-reviewed journal article. I have trouble believing it. I honestly do. But I cannot use the excuse that these things don't appear in journal articles. They do, with scholars who are willing to put their names behind it. Now, you might say, well, that was a single event. Is there some systematic study of miraculous healings or miraculous events that happen and are recorded in journal articles? And the answer is yes, and this one I do have. Dr. Candy Gunther Brown, in 2010, from a PhD from Harvard, published her Study of the Therapeutic Effects of Proximal Intercessory Prayer on Auditory and Visual Impairments in Rural Mozambique. Specifically, there are stories of a minister named Heidi Baker coming out of Mozambique, which argued that Heidi, who is herself a PhD, by the way, was praying for people to be healed of their blindness and of their deafness. And there was a high rate of people being miraculously healed. So Candy Gunther Brown from PhD goes to study to see, is this testable? She takes meters to test people's hearing. She takes instruments to test people's vision before they get prayed for and after they get prayed for. And she determines that, yes, there are healings that are happening through prayer. Multiple healings happening through prayer, recorded by a scholar in a peer-reviewed journal article, this scholar being graduated from Harvard. By the way, Heidi Baker is still in Mozambique. You can go and see what she's doing today if you'd like. You can talk to Dr. Candy Gunther Brown and see if her story holds water. The vast majority of people who deny miracles do so without having looked at any of this and just assuming that they don't happen. So the reality is, if you actually take a look at it, there's plenty of good reason to believe that miracles happen today if you take scientific inquiry into account. If you don't, if you presuppose that this doesn't happen, then of course no amount of evidence could ever convince you. But if you're looking for evidence, it's there. So, when we turn this question then, the question of something happening anomalously, to the question of, well, does that make it a miracle? Does this therefore mean we've had a miracle? I want to consider a context briefly, and then we'll begin to move on to the resurrection of Jesus and wrap up. Let's say that a blind man is rummaging through his cabinet, and he drops a jar of oil on his head, and all of a sudden, he can see. Should we call this anomaly a miracle? And I would argue, no, we shouldn't. Something happened. Maybe the knocking of his head caused something to shift in his visual cortex, and all of a sudden he can see again. Quite possible. I wouldn't call just the restoration of sight because of oil falling on his head to be a miracle. Now, let's say the same blind man was praying, as he often does. And he's praying, and he says in his prayer that he wants to be healed of his blindness. And for the first time, he hears something. And he hears the words, "Go 5 blocks down to such and such an address and knock on the door there, and you will find someone who will pray for you and restore your healing, restore your vision." Let's say the blind man gets past the fact that he's hearing someone speak to him and then decides he's going to give it a shot. Goes, finds his way to 5 blocks down, knocks on the door, but before he's able to say anything to the person who opens, the person inside says, "We were just having a Bible study, and a word came to us that a blind man was being sent to us, and we were to anoint his head with oil, and he was to receive his healing. We believe that you are an answer to that prayer. Come in." The man comes in, sits down, oil is poured on his head, and all of a sudden, his vision is restored to him. In that context, again, both of these contexts are hypothetical, but in that hypothetical context, would I say a miracle has happened? And I would argue, absolutely. The context is charged with religious expectation such that we can expect an anomalous event to be a miracle. The first one, no. There was no expectation of anything religious. The context was not religious. I wouldn't call it a miracle. But in the latter, the context is such that if something anomalous like that were to happen, then we could call it a miracle. Let's take everything we've discussed now and turn to the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. That was inevitable. The enterprise of history is to do very much what science is doing, to take bits of data and to try to explain them with a model that makes most sense. So in the case of the Caesar crossing the Rubicon, we have that reported, but does it make sense of the events that surround it? And the answer is yes, it does. In the case of Jesus' life, what we have are certain events, certain data that scholars of Jesus' life, whether they're atheist, agnostic, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, across the board, scholars of Jesus' life agree with these bits of data. Okay, the 3 that I'm going to mention tonight. Number 1, that Jesus died by crucifixion. Virtually everyone who studies Jesus' life, again, across the theological spectrum, will conclude that Jesus died by crucifixion. The evidence is that strong. I'm not appealing to authority here. I'm just trying to summarize the fact that the evidence is so strong that historians agree across the board Jesus died by crucifixion. It has to do with the early reports, both from Christians and non-Christians. For example, Josephus mentions it. Later reports, such as the Talmud, mention it. Non-Jewish reports, such as Tacitus, mention it. You have non-historical reports, such as Marabar Serapion, who's a Jew, writing a letter to his son, reporting Jesus' death by crucifixion. Those are just the non-Christian reports of Jesus' death by crucifixion. Then you have all those Christian reports of Jesus' death by crucifixion, which, interestingly, we should remember, they weren't born Christian. They became Christian because of Jesus' death and resurrection. So you have all these sources reporting it, such that scholars like Paula Fredrickson, who is not a conservative Christian by any means, argues that the death of Jesus Christ on the cross is one of the most solid facts of history. Okay, so fact number one, datum number one, Jesus died by crucifixion. Datum number two, that the disciples of Jesus believed he rose from the dead and appeared to them. Now, I'm not saying that just because they believed it, they were right. That's not what I'm arguing. They could have been wrong. They could have been misled. But it doesn't matter who you ask, atheist, agnostic, Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, doesn't matter. PhDs who studied Jesus' life, the historical Jesus, they will conclude, whether misled or not, the disciples truly believed Jesus had risen from the dead and appeared to them. In other words, to argue that they made it up doesn't make sense, because these men were willing to die for the sake of their belief. And you say, well, people are willing to die for the sake of their beliefs today. For example, the people who flew planes into the Twin Towers, they died for their beliefs. That doesn't make their beliefs true. Very astute. However, these people were in a position to know whether what they were saying is true or not. They were arguing that they themselves had seen the risen Jesus. It's not something they were told. It was something that they were testifying to. And so they truly believed it. Now, could they have hallucinated? Some scholars say yes, they could have hallucinated, but at least they truly believed it. That's datum number two. Datum number three, that certain enemies of Jesus truly believed Jesus had risen from the dead and appeared to him. Instead of using the word enemy, it might be a bit more objective to use the word people who were not followers of Jesus, believed that Jesus had rose from the dead and appeared to them. The number one example of this is, of course, Saul of Tarsus, also known as Paul. Paul, who was persecuting Christians, who was voting for their execution at times, all of a sudden became a Christian to the point where he was willing to be killed. He was beheaded for his proclamation that Jesus had risen from the dead. Again, could he have been wrong? Maybe, but he truly believed that Jesus had risen from the dead to the point where he was willing to give up his life to do so. Same with James, the brother of Jesus, wasn't following Jesus in his lifetime, but all of a sudden we see him as the leader of the church in Jerusalem. Why? Once again, the resurrection of Jesus is the argument. It was because he believed Jesus raised, he himself was willing to die, and he was killed as leader of the church in Jerusalem. So, what do we have? We have three historical bits of data that Jesus died on the cross, disciples of Jesus believed he had risen from the dead, and those who did not follow Jesus believed he had risen from the dead. Now, the job of the historian is to explain these three pieces of data with the best explanation possible, much like scientists try to explain their data with the best explanation possible. How is it that we can explain this? What is argued by scholar Gary Habermas and Michael Licona. Michael Licona is actually a professor at HBU just down the street if you want to talk to him at some point. What they argue is that no naturalistic hypothesis accounts for these 3 points of data well. So what is the primary naturalistic hypothesis used to argue that Jesus did not rise, that the disciples believed that he had risen from the dead, that Jesus actually died on the cross? The 3 points of data. What is the primary naturalistic explanation? That the disciples hallucinated. The primary explanation that non-Christians give, scholars who study Jesus' life, is that the disciples hallucinated the return of Jesus. We know that there are phenomena when a dearly beloved one dies, people think that they have appeared to them. It happens. It's true. So the argument is this is what happened to the disciples. Well, the problem is there is no example of a mass hallucination. Now, there are examples of mass illusions where people see something and misinterpret it, but there's no example of a mass hallucination where people see nothing and misinterpret it as the risen Jesus or of something else in particular. That is a problem with this view, but the bigger problem is that it doesn't explain the bit of datum that the enemies of Jesus, or people who didn't follow Jesus, also believed he had risen from the dead. What reason would Paul have to hallucinate the risen Jesus, thereby giving up everything that he ever acquired as being a student of Gamaliel, a top Jewish Pharisee? He had to give up everything. Why? Why would he hallucinate the risen Jesus? There is no naturalistic phenomenon to explain this. And so the argument that his resurrection was hallucinated by the disciples simply doesn't fit, because you had others who argued the same thing. Another common explanation of what happened to Jesus from a naturalistic perspective is that he never died on the cross at all. People will say, well, he didn't actually die on the cross. Therefore, when he appeared risen, it was actually just him having survived the cross. But once again, remember fact number one. Almost all the people who study Jesus' life conclude he died by crucifixion. The evidence is so strong. Just the process of crucifixion and how it works is extremely thorough. Nobody is ever in recorded history accounted as having survived a full Roman crucifixion. No one. There was a crucifixion that was interrupted in which 2 out of the 3 people still died, but no example of a full Roman crucifixion where anyone ever survived. So this doesn't accord with the evidence we have of crucifixions. Also doesn't accord with the testimony we have from multiple sources that he did die. So it doesn't fit. You start getting to interesting alternative hypotheses after that. Jesus had a twin who, after he was killed, came back and usurped power. We're pulling it a bit. That a super powerful alien came and made himself look like Jesus. Okay, really? That has been proposed, by the way. So we start getting to less and less likely scenarios in order to try to explain how it could be that Jesus did not rise from the dead. But when you take account of the data and you don't impose upon them naturalistic presuppositions, you just say, hey, Jesus died, and then people, both followers and non-followers, believed he had risen and appeared to them, so much so that they were willing to die for that belief. The best explanation is not hallucination. It's not that he survived the crucifixion. It's not a powerful super alien or his hidden twin brother. It's that he actually did rise from the dead. Now, I have seen in my studies that generally speaking, scholars of the New Testament and of the historical Jesus refuse to give an explanation of what happened. They'll say, we do not know what happened to Jesus. We don't know why all of a sudden people started preaching the risen Jesus. We cannot know. The only explanation that we could provide is that Jesus rose from the dead, but that would bring a miracle into the equation, and we as historians cannot argue for a miracle. I would say that's problematic. That's assuming a naturalistic worldview. We cannot do that as historians. We cannot presuppose a naturalistic worldview. Once again, if an environment and a context is charged with religious expectation, as it was in Jesus' case, it goes against the grain to presuppose a naturalistic worldview. It's not called for. And when we leave our options open, the best explanation of what happened to Jesus, according to a historical investigation, not to a theological one, not to an argument a priori that the Bible's reliable, therefore I believe what it says, but historically rigorous investigation of the events surrounding Jesus' death, the best conclusion we can have is that he rose from the dead. I saw this when I was a Muslim, and it would go against the grain of everything I had. My family, my religious heritage, my social context, everything in order for me to believe it. But the evidence was so strong that unless I wanted to go against the evidence for reasons that aren't intellectual, that aren't historical, then I had to accept the evidence where it pointed to. I would argue that is the inquiry of science, and that is the inquiry of faith when properly performed. And so for me, at great personal cost, I accepted the Christian message that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead based on the evidence before me. I can tell you this now. If I hadn't, I would be in no shape to talk to you tonight. If I didn't have excellent reason to believe that there is a life beyond this one, that this is not the end, there is more that is to come. This is in fact not even the beginning. This is an appetizer before the beginning, that true life starts when the veil is lifted. If I didn't actually believe that, there's no way I could be standing before you right now. When the doctors tell you you have 9 months to live, You don't walk out of there on your own confidence in life, on your own existential basis or grounding for living. The fact of the matter is, it's extremely difficult to extract meaning from life unless you believe that there's a greater purpose and a hand behind your creation. And if you're looking death in the face, and you know, because of reason, not because of blind faith, but because of reason, that there's more to life, then you can look death in the face with confidence. And that's where I am. I believe that miracles happen because I've studied it historically, I've studied it in journal articles, and it's happened to me personally. I believe in Jesus Christ of Nazareth risen from the dead because history points to it, people testify to it, and their reasoning is sound. And I believe that the end is not going to come for any of us, that all of us have eternal life. Now, what happens in that eternal life is something that we need to turn to Jesus to understand. If he truly did rise from the dead after claiming to be God, then we need to see what he has to say about what's going to happen to us in the afterlife, and we need to heed what he has to say. But I would tell you that there is hope, even in the face of death, and that's why I'm here to tell you that the evidence for the resurrection is so strong that once a scientist recognizes the limits of science and understands that science and faith are not at odds but work hand in hand, even a scientist can and should conclude that Jesus has risen from the dead. Thank you.
Okay, we are going to have a time of questions and answers. So let me explain to you about the question. If you could kindly word your question in the form of a question, it would be extremely helpful. All right? And so what happens is there's probably a lot of people that want to ask questions, and so I ask you to keep it short and concise. So get right to the point so that Nabeel can answer your question and the questions of many others. And so what you're going to do is if you're down in the front, you're going to move toward the back. If you're down in the back, you move toward the middle, and it's going to be right in the middle there. There'll be a couple of people on the ends that are going to just check from you, okay, give us the context of your question, because there's some questions that might not apply, like what's the structure of methane, for example? That doesn't really apply today. And so they're going to just check that. And then they'll release you to come into the middle, and Eric is going to hold that microphone. He's not going to give it up, all right? Because once people get a hold of a microphone, sometimes it gets out of hand. So Eric's going to hold that microphone, and you just speak your question into that microphone, and Nabeel will take it from there, okay?
Just real quick, I thought that was interesting. I don't know if you know this, but in, I believe it was the 18th century, a Belgian scientist was raking his brain over the question of what is the chemical structure of benzene. And the answer came to him in a dream. He saw a dream of a snake biting its own tail. And he was like, wait a minute, this is a circular structure. It's a ring structure. That's the one, Kekulé, thank you. So we have confirmation. So yeah, science, how about that?
So I'm going to ask the first question while everyone comes to, you can come talk to Mike or come talk to Juan right here. If you have questions, please go ahead and come now and line up and ask some questions. I'm going to start us off with a question. Nabeel, what is the best argument against the resurrection that you've ever heard, and why is that not sufficient for you?
Yeah, I would argue it's that. The best argument against the resurrection is an attempt to disqualify any supernatural phenomenon. So, in other words, the investigator would say, I'm a historian or I'm a scientist, and it's inappropriate for me to conclude a miracle has happened. And so the argument is attempting to define the parameters of the question such that you can't even conclude a miracle happened. But like I mentioned in the talk, that is not an appropriate method of investigation. I think when you have a context that calls for the potential of a miracle to have happened, you cannot automatically presuppose or preclude that miracle or presuppose reasonings against that miracle. So to give an example, let's say we had a camera. Remember the story about the man who had a bottle of oil drop on his head? Let's say we had a camera focused on that man when he was praying. And as he was praying, he then received the word, well, go to this house and 5 doors down, or 5 blocks down, people will pray for you. Let's say that was caught on camera, and you hear that on camera. And then let's say the healing was caught on camera as well. If a historian were to investigate those videotapes, I would say it is his duty to conclude a miracle has happened. He can't just say, well, I see it on the camera, I see what happened, I see the data, I see the evidence, I see the man, I see that he's healed, but I can't conclude a miracle has happened. No, you are now trying to superimpose naturalistic presuppositions. You're precluding the most likely conclusion based on your biases. It would be your duty to conclude a miracle has happened in that context. And so I don't think historical investigation naturally precludes the occurrence of a miracle. I do think that we shouldn't jump to miracle. You shouldn't just say, hey, a miracle happened. You should not do that. It should be the result of best explanation within a certain environment. And in this case, it absolutely is.
Hi there. Thanks so much for being here. Okay, so I really just wanted to ask about, for example, Sam Harris and some of the other new atheists make a sort of deterministic argument against free will for a lot of different reasons, but I was just wondering what your personal way is of reconciling like a Christian notion of free will with the proposal that after the Big Bang, certain chains of events were set in motion, and then, continuing on even to the neurons firing in our brains that determine our actions. Am I clear? Is that?
Yeah. Well, it was generally clear, and I'll give you a general answer. Well, to begin with, Christian notions of free will differ drastically. And so you have some within Calvinist camps, for example, who would take a much more determined view than would those in Arminian camps, for example. But by the way, that conversation tends to be an explicitly American one. But that shows that there's a disparity within the view of free will, even within Christendom. And then within philosophy, there's a disparity. Non-religious philosophy, there's also a disparity of what free will entails. Some people would argue for free will based on the uncertainty principle, but most don't. Most argue against any reality of free will. So for example, John Gray out of the UK is an atheist philosopher who would argue that there is no such thing as free will or even ethics and morality apart from the existence of God, and he is an atheist. Michael Roos, another atheist philosopher, says that any free will that you think you have is illusory. You don't have any free will because God doesn't exist, and you are simply the product of physics and chemistry. So in other words, let's put it this way. So if the world just exploded into existence and the galaxies and the stars are just the results of mathematics and physics and chemistry spinning a certain way. And then you have the Earth, which happens to be one speck of dust in the universe, happens to have come into this solar system, into this galaxy exactly the way that it did, such that life happened to come out of primordial soup for no specific intended purpose. It just happened to come up just because chemicals are spinning and physics is happening. And then that life evolved into us. We are no exception to the physics that are happening. Our brain, our thoughts, we might think that they are our thoughts and our desires and our conclusions, but in reality, it's just a brain that's fizzing, much like a soda would fizz on a tabletop. It's just the chemicals are just doing their thing, and that's what's happening in your brain. That's why people conclude a more or less deterministic view if you start with atheism, and materialism is probably a better way to put it. The problem with that, I think, has been amply put up by Alvin Plantinga. One of many problems with it, I think. I think there is something called an intuitive sense, which tells us that's simply not true. We have an ability to reason and decide for ourselves. But if we're going to go beyond something practical into something a little bit more defensible philosophically, Alvin Plantinga points this out. If you ever get the chance to listen to Alvin Plantinga, by the way, do it. He is hilarious. He's a cool old guy. I think of Gandalf when I see him. He comes up with some great quips, but his philosophy is par excellence. And he argues this. He says, if we, as primates that have evolved basically into Homo sapiens, have evolved such that we are the product of evolutionary attempts at survival, then our brain is designed to come up with truths that are actually survival truths. Where what we come up with, the way we live, the way we think is ultimately geared towards helping us survive. It doesn't actually tell us anything about the world around us with specificity except that which helps us survive. And so the question then becomes, why do we think our view of the world is true if our brains aren't instruments of detecting truth? If they're instruments of survival, what reason do we have to think that we have any access to truth whatsoever? And so the very notion of determining anything is undercut if we go with this purely naturalistic point of view. So once again, that's Alvin Plantinga. I think that addresses the question of determinism versus free will amply. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.
Hey, I just had a quick question. So, in your three kind of principles of the resurrection, you mentioned Jesus' enemies believing in him, and you specifically referenced Paul. What would you say to people? You know, there are some people who believe that Paul was crazy; he never met Jesus. So, how would you reconcile that as a foundation, I guess?
Yeah, great question. Very, again, so I was talking about scholars of the historical Jesus and what their views are. You have people who believe everything, by the way. You have people who believe that Jesus never existed. You have people who believe that life started 10 minutes ago, and we've just got memories that have been implanted into our brain. You've got people who take the Matrix way too seriously. So you have people of all kinds. I'm trying to limit the views to those who are experts in their field. And of the experts in historical Jesus studies, virtually none believes that about Paul. I can think of one who argued it and was shot down spectacularly by the rest of the field for good reasons. One good reason is that we have the story of Paul recorded quite well in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 9, actually the last verse, I believe, of Acts chapter 8, introduces Paul. And the person who is writing the book of Acts seems to have been a traveling companion of Paul, because you have a first-person plural appearance throughout the book of Acts, which shows that this person was actually with Paul as they were traveling. And so this author is describing who Paul is and what he's done. That's one testimony. Testimony number two is that of Paul himself. So in the book of Galatians, for example, you have Paul talking about his background, specifically as he interacted with Peter. You have Paul talking about the kinds of things he did that corroborates what we hear in the book of Acts. In the book of 1 Corinthians, also an authentic Pauline, according to New Testament scholarship, you have Paul actually giving quotes of what Jesus has said, some of which overlap with what we find in the Gospels written by other authors. So he obviously knows what happens to Jesus, at least such that he's quoting the same thing. You have also non-New Testamental literature. So for example, 1 Clement, that talks about Peter and Paul as people who had encountered the risen Jesus. So you've got a lot of sources, a lot of authors who are saying it. In addition, the evidence that Paul gives to make himself credible is he references himself as a student of Gamaliel. Now, Gamaliel was one of the top Pharisees of the day. He was actually referenced in the book of Acts as one of the ones who was interrogating Stephen. I believe it was Stephen. And so he's known in the book of Acts, but he's also known in Jewish annals. If you read any of the rabbinic literature, for example, the Mishnah discusses rabbis who came before, of course, going back to the time of Eleazar and Hillel, etc. And Gamaliel comes after that. And so Gamaliel is a well-known Jewish authority. And if Paul is trying to make himself sound credible, and he says, I was a student of Gamaliel, and he wasn't, that would totally undercut any authority he has, and it would make no sense for him to do that. And so there's good reason to think Paul was a student of Gamaliel. He did die, according to, again, non-New Testamental literature, arguing for the resurrection of Jesus to the emperor. So in the same year, both Paul and Peter die under the hands of Nero. And this is recorded in non-New Testamental literature. Why would he have done so? So the evidence that we have of Paul is both from himself and from others. And the most coherent picture we have is that he actually interacted with the disciples. And the disciples are saying that he actually interacted with the risen Jesus himself, or at least saw him. By the way, the argument that Paul never saw Jesus has been challenged, and quite well. I forget who it was who wrote the book, but there is a book which discusses Paul's life would have been lived, at least his religious life, very much so in Jerusalem at the same time that Jesus was ministering. And so it's just an assumption that Paul didn't actually see Jesus. He may have seen him preach. He may have heard him. May have seen him in the temple. There's no real reason to think he didn't see Jesus in the flesh. But we know, based on his testimony and others' testimonies, that he saw him risen. And that's at least the consensus of historical Jesus scholarship. Thanks.
Hi, I'm a new believer. I got baptized in my church a couple months ago.
Great, congratulations.
Thank you. So I was wondering, like, I believe resurrection, but how about the other stories in the Bible? For example, the story of Jonah. Like, do you see those stories as a sort of metaphor to help people understand, or do you see those as historical fact? Like a man can literally stay in the stomach of fish for like 3 days.
So I will answer your question from two perspectives. We have to understand that there's a lot of disagreement even within Christendom. So what I want to start with is people will often say, I'm not becoming a Christian until I can know that the Bible is the Word of God. And I'd say that there is good reason to do that. But on the flip side, the earliest Christians became Christians before the New Testament was ever written. So even before the 27 books of the New Testament were written, you had Christians. And never did they argue, I'm a Christian because I trust the Bible. Not once did people argue that. So even within the first generation of Christians, you had Gentiles who are non-Jews becoming Christian. And never are they argued into Christianity because, hey, look at what the Old Testament says, and you know the Old Testament's reliable, therefore you should become a Christian. The argument that is used is Jesus rose from the dead. We saw it. You can talk to these 500 people who saw it. Therefore, you should become a believer in the risen Jesus. And once that was taught, then people would teach these Gentiles, hey, here's what Jesus believed. Jesus believed in the inspiration of the Old Testament. And so the reliability of the Old Testament comes through the fact that these people are holding Jesus as their Lord. And Jesus taught the reliability of the Old Testament. So that is the angle through which I trust the Old Testament and New Testament as well. It's because I follow Jesus as Lord. So once again, just to make this a bit more clear, when I became Christian, it was never because I said, the Bible is the Word of God, it says Jesus is risen, therefore I'm Christian. No, I never followed that. That's circular reasoning. I said the historical evidence is solid. Jesus claimed to be God, and he proved it by rising from the dead. From a historical perspective, we can conclude this. And once I conclude that, I can then ask myself the question, what was Jesus' view of the Scripture? And Jesus' view is that he trusted the Old Testament, and he gave us reason to expect the New Testament would come. Therefore, I trust the New Testament as well. So now, getting to your specific question on the book of Jonah. That story, I believe it happened. There are Christian theologians, though, who would argue that some of the books of the Old Testament are designed to teach from a parabolic point of view. So Jesus would teach parables. He would say, in a certain city there was a woman who was a widow, and there was a judge, and she went to the judge for justice, and he wouldn't listen, etc. So he gives this, once upon a time kind of parable. And you know that when he says things like, in a certain city, that he's opening up with a parable, it's not meant to be a historical reality. It's, hey, this is a story from which I'm going to extract truth. Some Christian theologians say the same thing about the book of Jonah. They'll say the book of Jonah was a story which was designed to teach truth. They'll say the same thing for the book of Job. They'll say that doesn't mean that this is not inspired. That doesn't mean it's not the Word of God. It was designed for the same purpose that Jesus designed his parables. And so they'll argue from that perspective. I'm not convinced by that perspective. I think Jesus actually treated Jonah as a historical figure. we see in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus refers to Jonah more or less in a historical fashion. And so I believe, once again, grounded in Jesus, that this is actually a true event. But all that to say, there is latitude within the Christian faith. And so we shouldn't, just because we don't follow a certain view of Christendom doesn't mean we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, if that makes sense. Thanks.
Hey, my name is Eddie Morales.
Hi.
I just want to say good to see you and good, thank you for coming.
Thanks.
I was going to ask, you spoke about the Big Bang Theory and talked about how there's some models for origin of life that are viable in our scientific realm. Can you give examples of those, like if you were to come into contact with someone who would talk about those specific models?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask that. What I said was that there is no model that has been shown to be viable. Not that there are some. There aren't any. The one that I was taught in high school, I'm trying to remember the name of it. Perhaps you could remind me. Thank you. The Miller-Urey experiment. That reminds me of a joke. I'm not sure if you've heard it, but there was a lecturer who was going from town to town preaching the lecture, and his driver had heard it so much that he said, "I can preach your lecture just fine. You don't need to do it." So the lecturer says, "Fine, go ahead." And then the driver preaches the lecture exactly the way the lecturer does, and people give him a standing ovation. At the end, someone comes up to ask a question, and he says, "That is such an easy question to answer. I'm going to let my driver answer it." So right now I feel like the driver in lecturer's clothes when I have Dr. Tour next to me. But the Miller-Urey experiment was this. It was basically that you added into a closed environment nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon. Basically what was expected to be the elements on the face of the primordial earth. Once you have that in a closed system and you add electricity to that system, it would produce amino acids. And amino acids, as we know, are the building blocks of life. So amino acids start coming together, you get proteins, and proteins, you get tissue, you get life. And so this was something that was taught to me when I was going up through school. I saw the experiment, learned it, and this was for us the explanation for the origin of life. The reality is, though, that the Miller-Urey experiment was shown to have fudged the data tremendously. So this is, again, where the repetition within scientific inquiry is important. When people tried to reproduce the results of the Miller-Urey experiment, what they found was the vast majority of the products of this experiment were organically inert. They could not produce life. Another problem was that these chemicals lacked the chirality of life. So if you study organic chemistry, you will know that there's handedness in molecules. Certain molecules have handedness, left-handed versus right-handed. And the molecules which are the basis of life are uniformly chiral, whereas they're sided. Whereas the products of this experiment had an equal amount of each side, which does not concur with what we know about life. And there are more problems with the experiment. I'd have to look at it again to get you all the details. But that was the one that was hailed as the best explanation. Oh, yeah, here was another one. The assumption that those were the four chemicals that existed at the beginning of the Earth was just that, an assumption. And in fact, the more we studied it, the more we realized those were not the chemicals that existed on the face of the Earth initially. You had, an oxidized environment in one assumption, and that simply wasn't the case. So those are some of the problems with the Miller-Urey experiment, and that was the best explanation. There are other explanations, but they all tend to have significant problems. And so once again, I say, it might come down to it in maybe 100 years where we have a viable model. And if we have enough faith in science to believe that, that's fine. But as for now, abiogenesis has no good non-theistic explanation. You're welcome. There are other things, by the way, that have no good non-theistic explanation. So, for example, consciousness. You have, Daniel Dennett has tried to argue that there's a foundation for consciousness, but once again, most scientists conclude that not only is there none, but there can be none. But we can get into that in another time. Thanks.
Hello. My question, well, first I have to give the background.
Can you give the background in the form of a question?
In 2006, there was a New York Times article that reported on a study that was trying to show the efficacy of prayer after surgery. And this study was done on 1,800 patients across 6 hospitals who all underwent coronary bypass surgery. And the researchers split the 1,800 patients into 3 groups. One that received prayer and knew about it, one that received prayer and didn't know about it, and one that didn't receive any prayer at all. And the group that received prayer and didn't know about it did just as well in their recovery as the people who didn't receive prayer. And the group that received prayer and knew about it actually did worse, possibly because of performance anxiety. So my question is this the proper intersection of faith and science, and how should we view those results?
Yeah, great question. I would have to look at the methodology of the experiment. I recall having done so, and I saw some issues with the methodology. I can't recall what they are now to be specific, but it's important to look at the methodology for one. For two, that was one experiment, and there are other experiments that have been done that did show a correlation between prayer and healing. And so we can't necessarily lift one up above another. Now, the population sample is quite high in the one that you're discussing, that's true. But it was an experiment conducted by one body amongst others. So what we should do is a meta-narrative, a meta-assessment of a variety of surveys and studies that were done. But the thing that resonates most with me is that when we're talking about God, we're talking about a person, or 3 persons if you believe in the Trinity. And frankly, persons don't like being experimented on. And so if you were going to do an experiment with me, a double-blind experiment with me on 18,000 people, and how I would react to them in a given situation, I would go out of my way to say, no, you're not going to experiment on me. I don't want that. We have to take into account that God is a person, and he has a will of his own. So when you treat him as a mechanism, as a system, I think that is repugnant to him. And I think that's what that study was doing. Also, I do believe I recall some of the issues with the methodology. Some of the people who were praying didn't actually believe in prayer, for one. They didn't make it an effort to find people who believed in prayer. They also didn't make it an effort to see if the people praying or the people receiving prayer had faith in the healing. And that's actually something that Jesus talks about quite a bit, that you're supposed to have faith in the healing, either the person praying or the person receiving prayer, both. He doesn't specify exactly what that equation should look like, but faith needs to be there, faith for healing, and that wasn't a part of that research. So I'd say that there are experimental flaws, but ultimately you can't put a person in a test tube, and that's what people were trying to do with that study. I much more like the approach of the scientist that we talked about who is studying the healings in Mozambique, where there's something already happening, and she's going to test and see whether this is something she can proclaim to the world. And she said she could. Again, a Harvard PhD. So I like that approach a lot better. It's instead of turning God into a box, it's saying, let me see, God, if you're actually doing something or not, that I can then proclaim objectively. You're welcome.
Hi, Nabeel. So I had a question given to me by a student who asked me to read it for him, basically.
Go ahead, read your question. His question.
Yes. The question is, why do you believe in the resurrection as opposed to other supernatural theories like the substitution theory in Islam, where Allah put the image of Jesus on another person's body?
Yeah, so I have a chapter on that in my book, No God But One. So if you want more details on that question, the book will hopefully be outside. I forgot to bring it, so we sent someone to go get it. Basically, when we're talking about the Islamic worldview, so in Islam, the argument is that, well, there's two. There's two views within Islam on what happened to Jesus. One view is that Jesus did not die on the cross, that he survived the crucifixion, and I would call that the theistic swoon theory. And the other view is that Jesus' face was substituted for somebody else. Usually it's said that it's substituted by Judas or Simon of Cyrene. And it was either Judas or Simon of Cyrene who was killed on the cross and not Jesus. Both of these approaches are problematic. Number one, I'll start with the main view, which is the substitution theory. When you look at the Quran and you see what the Quran says about Jesus, what you find is that the Quran usually gets its information about Jesus from apocryphal gospels or Gnostic gospels. So, for example, the Quran talks about Jesus giving life to clay birds. Okay, that isn't something that actually happened. That's a story that was invented well over 100 years after Jesus died, and it's something that we find in the infancy gospel of Thomas. It's a fascinating story. I think it's hilarious. What Jesus is doing in the infancy gospel of Thomas is he's being a little mischievous brat, basically. He's like, hey, cool, I have superpowers. And so he goes to people who annoy him, and he kills them or strikes them down or something. And when people are like, hey, why are you killing people, Jesus? He's like, oh, okay, fine, and he raises them up. And so it's a book that's meant to be entertaining and apocryphal. Well, one of the stories in that book is that Jesus was making clay birds on the Sabbath. Now, you're not supposed to make anything on the Sabbath as a Jew. And so people went up to Jesus' father and they said, or they went up to Jesus and they said, why are you making things on the Sabbath? And Jesus is like, I'm not making birds, I'm playing with birds. And then he blows life into those clay birds, and the birds fly away. So mischievous Jesus gets away with something once again. He was making clay birds, but he pretended he wasn't. This only makes sense in a Jewish context, by the way, people who understand what the Sabbath is. But we know exactly where the story came from. It came from an apocryphal source. And yet it finds its way into the Quran as if it were true, because it was a very popular story. Same thing with Jesus speaking from the cradle. The Quran says Jesus spoke the moment he was born. People went to Mary and said, Mary, how are you pregnant when you're not even married yet? We thought you were a holy woman. And Mary's like, don't ask me, ask Jesus. And here's baby Jesus like, I'll tell you. And this story comes from the Arabic infancy gospel. So the Arabic infancy gospel is a gospel which says Jesus is the Word incarnate, the eternal Word. And so once you believe that he's the eternal Word, it's one step away from saying when he was a baby he could speak. And that's what that gospel says, able to even speak from the cradle. But it was speaking more testimonially, not physically speaking. Yet the Quran picks that up and says this is what Jesus was able to do. He was able to speak from birth. Once again, an apocryphal story finding its way into the Quran. The story that Jesus was substituted, which is the one you questioned about, was one that comes from an apocryphal source as well. This one from a Gnostic gospel. It comes from the Gospel of Basilides, a 2nd century gospel, where you had more or less a Docetist view that Jesus seemed to be physical, seemed to be real, whereas in reality he was supernatural, he was ethereal. So he had no body that could be crucified. He was so divine that he had no body that could be crucified. So the person who was crucified was substituted in his place, argues the Gospel of Basilides. And in this case, I believe it was Simon of Cyrene. When he went to carry the cross, his face, Jesus' face, was placed upon Simon of Cyrene. They crucified him while Jesus stood aside laughing. And so you have what appears to be that Jesus died by crucifixion. And what the Quran says in chapter 4, verse 157, is he was neither killed nor was he crucified, but so it seemed. Almost directly out of the Gospel of Basilides. But once again, it's a Gnostic source. It's not a historical source. So for these reasons, I would have significant issue accepting what the Quran says about Jesus. But beyond that, there's a theological concern about believing that Jesus' face was substituted upon somebody else. If Allah kept Jesus alive by putting his face on somebody else, such that all the disciples believe Jesus was raised from the dead, and you get the start of this religion called Christianity, where people think Jesus is God. In fact, more people in all of history subscribe to this religion than any other. If God did that just to save Jesus' life, then he has condemned billions of people to hell, because don't forget, the Quran says that in chapter 5, verse 72, if you believe Jesus is God, you will go to hell. So people believe Jesus is God, billions of people believe Jesus is God, just so Jesus could be saved, so Allah could save Jesus from the cross. That is really problematic. It shows that God's willing to consign many, many people to hell for the sake of one person. In addition to that, it makes Jesus an incompetent Messiah. Because why couldn't he tell his own disciples, hey, I didn't die on the cross? If all of them are going around saying Jesus died on the cross and he really didn't, it makes him an incompetent Messiah for not having been able to tell them that. In fact, not having been able to tell them much of anything, because in Islam, Jesus was saying he is not God, he's just a prophet. But he couldn't even get that simple message across to the disciples. So those are the main issues I have with those theories. The theistic swoon theory, of course, the main issue I have is it goes against all the evidence. Jesus did die by crucifixion. So, but I have, again, a whole chapter on this in No God But One. Thanks.
Hello. So my question is about us being made in the image of God. So the Bible says that we're made in the image of God, meaning that we have his character and like love and compassion and so on. Not that we literally look like him. And so sometimes when I talk to people about that, they say that animals are also made in that image because they have love and compassion for each other, saying that we're no different. So how would you argue that we're different from animals?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would once again argue that there's a variety of viewpoints on what it means to be made in the image of God within Christendom. So if you talk to one theologian, they'll say it means one thing. You talk to another theologian, they'll say it means another. I take the position that to be made in the image of God means to have truly selfless love. And that requires an understanding of good and evil, of morality, and it requires an understanding of self and other. And it requires an understanding of true altruism. Now, there are animals that approximate selfless love. For example, elephants, when they die, you will see other elephants mourning, sometimes even coming to a grave site, if you will, to mourn the death of an elephant. Dogs, there's a story, a very moving story of Hachiko, the dog in Japan, whose master went off to work one day, and he would always follow his master to work, and then at least to the bus, I think it was, or the train. And then when his master would come back, he would meet him there and come home. Well, his master died at work one day, and so Hachiko kept going to the train every single day for decades, waiting for his master to come back. Very moving story. They have a little statue of Hachiko in Tokyo. But is this altruistic love, truly? Or is it a love for one that served you, in the case of Hachiko? Or is it a love, in the case of the elephants, that is a species love designed to continue the propagation of the species? I believe that mankind is the only one of all species on the earth that truly understands a selfless love in a moral sense. Animals, and J.P. Moreland, he's a philosopher. You'll find a lot more through J.P. Moreland's work. He's a philosopher at Biola University. J.P. Moreland argues that animals have thoughts, but they don't have thoughts about their thoughts, whereas humans do. Humans have thoughts about their thoughts, and that's what separates mankind and makes mankind in God's image. So that's another way of approaching this, the same issue. I focus on the issue of love. He keeps it more general on thoughts. But those are two approaches to answer the question. I hope that helps.
Hi, my question is about kind of the historical emergence of Christianity out of the Jewish faith, and who are a particular group of people in the Middle East at the time that I guess Jesus was born and then lived his life. And so the Bible is a history of that specific people group, but doesn't necessarily address like other ancient civilizations that we believe from historical evidence to have been existing at the time. And sort of my question is about sort of how we sort of reconcile this chosen people narrative with also the narrative that Jesus brings, that I guess Christianity is for the Jews, is for the Gentiles, but sort of like so much of Jesus' life is predicated on these certain prophecies that came out of a certain religion. So I guess if you're not from that people group, then that might not necessarily feel linked to your history.
Yeah, it's a great question. It really is, because that was a prominent issue in the early church. What do we do with these Gentiles? Do they have to follow the law or not? Such that there were multiple councils held to discuss how did Gentiles interact with Jews. When you look at the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Scriptures, what you will find, as opposed to most documents that try to uphold a specific people group, usually their own people group. So if you have, for example, the Vedas, which talk about Indian history, generally speaking, there is an elevation of that people, which is clear and pretty much incontrovertible. In the case of the Old Testament, you don't see that. You do see God saying that you have been chosen, he says to the Jews. But what he says, and I believe this is in Deuteronomy chapter 9, it might be Deuteronomy chapter 7, what he says is, you have been chosen to basically receive the blessing or the curse. In other words, if you follow me and you do what I tell you to do, you'll be blessed above and beyond all people. But if you do not do what I tell you to do, you will be cursed above and beyond all people. So it's not elevating the Jews, because what we find out actually throughout the books of the Old Testament, after you get through the Pentateuch and you get through the prophets and the other historical writings in the Old Testament, starting from Joshua and on, what you find is the Jews do not actually follow God, and they do get cursed more than any other people group, such that it explains the destruction of the temple and dispersing of the Jews amongst the Babylonians. So as opposed to many nationalistic writings which lift the people up, the Old Testament time and time and time again points to its forefathers and says, look how they messed up, look how they messed up, look how they messed up. And that is really, I think, among the unique characteristics of the Old Testament, such that it invites other people groups in. So let's look, for example, at the book of Jonah, as was described earlier. The Ninevites are sinning. Jonah is sent to proclaim to the Ninevites that they should repent. The Ninevites have no inkling about the Jewish God, none whatsoever, and yet when they hear the message, they repent immediately, which makes them look far better than the Jews have looked throughout the Old Testament. And yet this is a story which is embedded deeply within the psyche of the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, like I said, it appears in Matthew chapter 12. So time and time again, you have this book, the Bible, which shows that other people groups are tremendously well respected, sometimes even made to look better than the Jews. Also, you find within the Pentateuch laws which uphold the sojourner. So non-Israelites, non-Hebrews traveling through Israel are given a lot of respect and accorded great treatment throughout the Old Testament. So you find that this intersection of the Jews and Gentiles to be not one that's, as it's often caricatured, as extreme animosity. That's simply not the case. When you look at Jesus, and he talks about people who have faith, there's a centurion who comes to him and says, I believe this is in Matthew chapter 8, a centurion says, will you heal my servant? So here's a guy, a centurion, who loves his servant. You don't even see love like that in much of the rest of the Gospels. And so Jesus says, yes, I can come and heal him. And the centurion says, no, you have authority to heal him from where you are. I know the Jewish laws. I know that you can't come into my house, so don't bother yourself. Just go ahead and heal him from where you are. And Jesus' response is that he marveled at the centurion. And Jesus doesn't marvel at any other point in the Gospels. He marvels at this Gentile. And he says, I haven't found such great faith in Israel. So once again, he says, this person has more faith than all the Jews that I've interacted with. So much so that there are many scholars in the 20th century who see the New Testament as anti-Semitic literature, which is ridiculous because it was written by Jews, but whatever. It just goes to show how pro-Gentile the Gospels can be at a certain point. And so basically, unlike other books that are written from a very geocentric perspective, this book, the Bible, 66 books actually, upholds the other as well as the Jew. Let's see how much more I want to address this. When you have the New Testament developing, you see the message in the book of Acts saying, so Acts chapter 1, verse 8, that the message is supposed to start in Judea and go to Samaria and then to the ends of the earth. Now, Samaria, we have to remember, is the inveterate enemy of most of the Jews in Judea. So they're seen as basically evil half-brothers of the Jews. So to say that this message is to go to Samaria is a powerful one. Of course, we already saw Jesus in the Gospel of Luke give it a parable that upholds a good Samaritan. But then it also says that the message is to go to the ends of the earth. And where does the book of Acts end? In chapter 28, Paul is preaching the gospel in Rome. And from Rome, of course, we know the roads lead everywhere. And so the message is that of it going to all the ends of the earth. So built into the Christian message is the reality that this is for all people. And the discussions, for example, in the book of Galatians, which discusses whether Gentiles are supposed to follow the law, are an elaboration of that. I hope that helps. Thanks.
Hi, Mr. Nabeel. I have a question.
Yeah.
This is the third time I've heard you speak, but the first time that I've been allowed to ask a question, which is exciting and nerve-wracking, so I apologize if my voice is unsteady. I have a friend who I've known for 15 years. She grew up in a home of non-believers. I grew up in a home of believers, yet I'm not well-versed in Christianity. So she always says when I tell her that, yes, kind of a point you mentioned, the disciples stand by Jesus' resurrection, even non-believers in that time that you call enemies stand by his resurrection, and they saw it. She goes with the whole hallucination theory you were mentioning, because she says there's plenty of people who believe aliens exist. They say they were abducted. They've seen ships. Same thing with Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster. So what would you say to her to argue back that, what she tells me?
Yeah. So there are, Bigfoot sightings. But the difference with Christianity, for one, is that you have a specific event where 500 people saw the risen Jesus at once. So this is actually provided in 1 Corinthians 15 as the basis for the establishment of the church. Paul says, I passed on to you as of first importance what I also received, that Jesus Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was raised on the third day, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, and then to 500 at once, most of whom are alive, but some of whom are asleep, and then last of all, as to me, as one untimely born. The phrase that Paul uses to say, I passed on to you as of first importance what I also received, is actually the word hystereo. So in other words, this is history. This is what's been passed on as fact, not as just hearsay. That Jesus Christ died on the cross and rose from the dead, and 500 people saw him at once. If you look at the book of Acts carefully, start, for example, with Acts chapter 1, when they're trying to replace Judas, and they're saying, who can we have replace Judas as one of the 12? The criteria required to pick someone was you had to have been with Jesus from the beginning, and you had to have seen him raised from the dead, so that you can proclaim the gospel. In Acts chapter 2, what do you see? Peter preaching the gospel. He was an eyewitness of the resurrection. That happens consistently throughout the gospel. Acts chapter 10, it's Peter and his companions who saw the risen Jesus. In Acts chapter 13, it's Paul and his disciples who saw the risen Jesus. So this message is spread by people who claim to have seen him and then who are willing to die for that belief. So it's not just, hey, I saw Bigfoot. It's, hey, I saw Bigfoot and I will die for that belief. And that's not something you generally see. And also it's, and I saw it with 499 other people who are also willing to die for this belief. So this goes above and beyond simple sightings. It's a group, and it's the willingness to truly die for their beliefs, which is why the scholars who study the historical Jesus say, look, they really believed it. People who have Bigfoot sightings, do they really believe it? I don't know. Some do, some don't. I don't know. But when it comes to the disciples, they really believed it. In the case of, again, Paul, you had someone who wasn't following Jesus, had nothing to gain from saying he saw the risen Jesus. In fact, he lost everything, ultimately his life, for saying he saw the risen Jesus. So if you're willing to give up that much for your claim and then to die, you're much more credible than someone just saying, ooh, I was abducted. Not to say people weren't abducted. I'm not gonna draw that judgment. Maybe they're abducted by aliens, sure. But I'd be much more likely to believe them if they were willing to die for it and 500 other people were abducted at the same time. Then I'd be much more willing to believe it. You're welcome.
Nabeel, this is our final question. Christians make a big deal about the bodily resurrection of Jesus. is it possible that the resurrection could have just been spiritual? And if not, why is the bodily resurrection important or meaningful?
Yeah, and there's disagreement among scholarship on this issue. So, for example, I studied at Duke University in the New Testament department, and there are many who were there, professors who would call themselves Christian, but very few who actually believe in the bodily resurrection. I do believe that the New Testament says you have to believe in the bodily resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15 makes that pretty clear. What was the second part of your question?
Is it possible that it was spiritual? And if not, why is the bodily resurrection important?
Yeah, so the view of resurrection in that time was a physical one. For example, I believe it was, who was it? Was it Joseph who asked for his bones to be taken? It was Joseph who asked for his bones to be taken when ultimately the Jews would go to the Promised Land. Why? Because it was viewed at the time that the bones themselves would be restored to life. The tombs throughout Judea often had bones that were placed there, which were, the reasoning behind which was that these are the very bones that will be raised. This is why Jews weren't cremated, and why when their bodies were desecrated, for example, by the Romans, it was seen as a tremendous affront. That was the view of resurrection. So to impute upon Jesus the view of a spiritual resurrection, I think, is actually anachronistic, and it speaks against what Paul clearly says in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, Paul does say that there is another kind of body once you're raised. That there's the perishable body versus the imperishable body. But once again, it is a body. It is a physical body. Also, Jesus in the book of John says, "If you don't believe it's me, put your finger in my side." And Thomas is like, and so once again, within the Gospel of John, you have more reason to believe. We're talking about a physical resurrection here. So I would say to argue a non-physical resurrection is going against what the message says. It's going against what Jesus was saying when he said, "I would rise from the dead." Thank you so much. It's been an absolute honor to speak to you tonight.